Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Rennie, and I'm a summer program assistant here at the Work Center. Most of you are here because you're participating in one of our workshops. But for those who aren't, for 9 weeks every summer, the Fine Arts Work Center hosts week-long open enrollment visual arts and writing workshops. If anyone here is interested in learning more, you can ask me or any of the staff on hand after the event. Staff, please make a wave. There they are in the back. If you're here longer than this week, you should think about taking one of our workshops. I promise you won't regret it. One of our favorite parts of our summer programs is that every week our world-class faculty mesmerizes our audiences with presentations and talks. Tonight we're going to hear from 3 faculty members. Writers Sarah Schulman and Garrett Connolly will read from their work, and visual artist Paul Stopforth will give a presentation. These will be followed by a Q&A with the audience. Before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. Please silence your cell phones if you haven't already done that. Books by Sarah and Garrett will be on sale at the back of the room after the event, and they'll be signing their books up here at the front of the room. Other books from this year's faculty will also be for sale in our bookstore and at the back of the room, as well as some very pretty Falk merchandise. So be sure to check it out. Also, the Hudson D. Walker Gallery will be open after the event. Right now, we're showing an amazing exhibit called Density's Glitch, which features work by former Falk fellows. The proceeds of all work sold will go to support Falk's programs, so be sure to check it out after the event. Okay, and now a big shout out to our partners who've been so generous. They include Relish, who's providing our breakfasts all week, Cosmos, who provided our boxed meals on the first night and dessert this evening, and East End Books, who have helped us stock and set up our bookstore. Restrooms are located down the hall that way. And finally, I already made the note about cell phones. Okay, we'll begin with writer Sarah Schulman, who's teaching a workshop this week called The Craft Fundamentals of Fiction and Nonfiction Writing. Sarah is a novelist, playwright, screenwriter, nonfiction writer, and AIDS historian. Her 20th book, Let the Record Show, A Political History of ACT UP, New York, was published in 2021. Publishers Weekly described her work as witty, hardcore, and insightful, and the New York Times praised the intersectionality of her documentation of the AIDS crisis. Her readers note how profound and compelling her narratives are, as well as the respect and interest she pays to the history she discusses. Her fabulous play, Lady Hamlet, is currently playing to rave reviews at the Provincetown Theater, with only this and next week left in its run. So if you haven't already seen it, we highly recommend. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Sarah Schulman.
Hi, everyone. I love teaching here. The students self-select, and they're just fabulous. We had a really good day today. So this is my new book. It's an 800-page history of ACT UP New York. I'm going to talk for 15 minutes a little bit about the process of putting the book together and what the issues were. So, the first thing that became clear in writing something about the AIDS activist organization ACT UP is that AIDS has been misrepresented since the beginning. And so you have to grapple with that when you're writing a book 40 years after the, quote, start. And let's start with the question of the start. So, we now know that AIDS has existed for about 100 years and was probably in the United States in the 1940s and certainly was in New York in the 60s and 70s. But science did not notice the pattern until 1981. So when we say that AIDS started in 1981, that's actually not true. It's just that that's when it was noticed. And my first public announcement was a piece in the New York Times on July 3rd, 1981, 41 cases of rare cancer found among homosexuals. Now, I just want to break that down for you in the context of 1981. So we're talking about a period when gay sex was illegal. In fact, sodomy laws were not overturned until 2003. In New York City, gay people could be fired from their jobs. They could be kicked out of their apartments. There was no gay rights bill in New York City at the time. Familial homophobia was virulent and was the cultural norm. And street violence, both by the police and by other people, which was called gay bashing, was like a form of public entertainment. So we're talking about a profoundly oppressed group of people who really had no rights. Now, at the time, because of all this stigma and illegality, there was a kind of cultural obsession with trying to understand the cause of homosexuality. And of course, once we want to understand the cause, it means the thing itself is stigmatized. Like nobody says, why do people like sports, or something like that. And so there was this idea that homosexuality was one thing. Now, today we know that gender and sexuality are different in each person and that they can change over your lifetime. But back in 1981, that was not the thought. Homosexuality was seen as one thing and that it had a biological cause. And they were looking for the cause. And those of you who are old may remember the hypothalamus a theory that it was caused by your hypothalamus gland. This was actually taken seriously. There was a lot of pseudoscience at the time. So when the New York Times said 41 cases of rare cancer found among homosexuals, what they were really talking about was the biological disease of homosexuality itself. And that was where the beginning of the AIDS discourse was. So the first name for the disease was GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. Like now we know that there's no such thing as gay-related immune deficiency because there's no biomarker for queer. And that's why phrases like gay cancer cannot exist. There's no such thing as gay cancer. Cancer cannot be gay. But these early terms show you what people were thinking at the time, what the dominant cultural mode was. Now, in the first 5 years of the epidemic, 40,000 people died in this country, and the government did absolutely nothing. And pharma really did nothing. They had patents that they owned on failed cancer drugs that they were trying to recycle. So what they were looking for was the pill that you would take that would make your AIDS go away. Now, people with AIDS had really different needs. So AIDS is like an umbrella term, like cancer. It means that your immune system is not working, and as it breaks down, you develop opportunistic infections. The different people would develop different ones in different orders. So like it would be like blindness, dementia, skin cancer called Kaposi sarcoma. The nerves in your legs would swell. People could not retain nutrition. I mean, an AIDS death without treatment was a brutal, brutal death, and people really suffered. So people with AIDS wanted treatments for each of these opportunistic infections. But pharma was not willing to research that because they wanted the big market. They didn't want the little slices of market share. So that's where things were. And what the gay community did in the first 5 years is try to recreate some facsimile of social services. The fact of familial homophobia is very important in this early period because the kinds of supports that would have come for many people from family networks did not exist. And so the gay community had to provide those things. So when you look at what kind of organizing was going on in the first 5 years, you see things like Gay Men's Health Crisis had a buddy program started by a Puerto Rican social worker named Diego Lopez, who died of AIDS. So you could volunteer and you'd be assigned to a person with AIDS and you'd like hang out with them or help them, do food shopping or something. There wasn't much you could do except to sort of be a friend. There were groups like Paws that would walk people's dogs so they could keep their pets, which is very important, right? You want to keep your dog if you're going through something, if you're dying. Or God's Love We Deliver, which would deliver free meals to homebound people with AIDS. But these were all sort of community-based social services. It wasn't until 1986, and this is very for us now because of what we're going through with abortion, the Supreme Court, in the case Bowers v. Hardwick in '86, held sodomy laws. So right in the middle of this mass death experience that was AIDS, the Supreme Court was saying, oh yeah, gay sex should remain illegal. And people were just enraged. And it did take 17 years from that date to overturn sodomy laws. So you see how long it can take. But But there were angry demonstrations in Washington and in New York without permits. And it was this politicization. Now at this point, we're at 87 now, so it's 6 years into the crisis, that really paved the way for ACT UP to be founded in New York on March 10th of 1987. So in the years that I cover, 87 to 93, had amazing victories. And I just want to let you know what they are, because there are very few social movements that we actually have histories of. It's quite hard to get information about social movements because the corporate media does not report on them accurately. And to have a movement that was this successful, I think gives us a reason to want to understand why they were so successful and if we can learn anything from them now. So some of their basic victories were that ACT UP forced FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, to create a parallel track system so that people who were sick could get access to drugs that had not gone through the full approval process. ACT UP forced the CDC and Social Security to change the official definition of what AIDS was, what you had to meet to get an AIDS diagnosis, because women were getting different symptoms than men, and they weren't getting the symptoms that were on the official diagnosis, so women were not qualifying for benefits. And women with AIDS tended to be poorer, tended to get diagnosed more further along in the illness, because women usually get diagnosed at a higher state of progression because they don't go to the doctor because they're taking care of other people. So those benefits were key. But the other thing that was going on with women is that in the 1960s, there was this drug called thalidomide that was given to pregnant women, many of whom had children born without limbs. They sued pharma, and pharma had to pay out hundreds of millions of dollars. So their solution was no more women in experimental drug trials. So when AIDS came along, AIDS could not get experimental drugs. And when there is no treatment, that's the only treatment. So ACT UP fought that also. And after 4 years, they won what was really the biggest victory for women and people of color in the history of HIV. So today, any woman in the world who takes an HIV drug is taking something that was tested on women because of this change. ACT UP created forced needle exchange in New York City. And the way they did it, now this was a time, I'm just looking at my clock, I'm good, where the main argument against addiction was abstinence. And harm reduction was a brand new idea. And there was a lot of suspicion around harm reduction and around needle exchange. So active and former drug users in ACT UP illegally exchanged needles so that they could get arrested. This is a high-risk strategy, right? And a test case, and they did it, and they won. And that's why there's needle exchange in New York. ACT UP took on the Catholic Church. This was before the priest scandal, when the Catholic Church was very powerful in New York, and the cardinal was more powerful than the mayor, and in fact was in office longer. And the church was trying to stop condom distribution in the public schools, and ACT UP distributed Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral in 1989 and kept the condom distribution program in the public schools. But most importantly, they really transformed the way people with AIDS and queer people feel about ourselves today and saw ourselves and were seen by others around the world. So how did they do it? I just think that one of the biggest takeaways from this is that ACT UP was not a consensus-based movement. People did not have to agree in order for something to go forward. They had a one-line statement of unity, which was direct action to end the AIDS crisis, and that was direct action as opposed to social service provision. So if you wanted to do direct action to end the AIDS crisis, basically you could do it. If I agree with you, we would fight, because this was New York, and people would scream at each other, and in fact we are still screaming at each other in our 60s and 70s. But in the end, if we and you wanted to do something and I didn't like it, I just wouldn't do it. I would just get my little group to do what I wanted to do. And so when I studied like the breadth of the organization, I could see that there was a simultaneity of response. So many different people were acting in different ways with different aesthetics and different strategies aimed at different social milieu at the same that is what created the paradigm shift. So that is a radical democracy. And I think that that's something we can really learn from today. Homogeneity does not work. Forcing people to all agree on one analysis or one strategy does not work. You do have to have a bottom line, but I think real leadership is about helping people be effective from where they're at, because people can only be where they're at. And that's like a lesson that's hard for all of us to learn. But anyway, so thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Now we will hear from writer Garrett Connolly, who's teaching a course this week called Jumpstart Your Nonfiction Project. Garrett is the author of Boy Erased, now a major motion picture, and the creator and producer of the podcast Unerased, The History of Conversion Therapy in America. His second book, a novel about queer 18th century lives, is forthcoming. He has written for the New York Times, Oxford American, Time, Vice, the Florida Review, Virginia Quarterly Review, and others. Kirkus Reviews described his debut memoir as sharp and shocking, and Medium called his work raw and reflective, as well as praising the comfort and catharsis that his work provides so many. He serves as assistant professor of creative writing at Kennesaw State University. Please give a warm welcome to Garrett Conley.
Wow. Sarah, that was amazing. And one of the things that really stood out to me was how necessary that is for any social movement, you know, to really allow people to come from wherever they're located. At the beginning, you know, I had to kind of learn how to do activism with ending conversion therapy. You know, there's a sort of homogeneity sometimes online where people are like, you have to do it this way, and you can't do it that way. So it's just so amazing to hear that and really affirming. Thank you, everyone. It's so wonderful to be back in person. I love it. I love seeing all your faces. I'm going to be reading from a piece that I published in the Oxford American. I'm just setting my timer real quick. So I moved to Georgia recently after being out of the South for quite a while. And one of the things I tried to do was to try to get a sense of like what it meant to be an artist in the South again. And my best way to do that was really to start studying other artists that I really enjoyed that lived in Georgia or had lived in Georgia. And so this is a piece that starts out about my father, but then becomes a piece about the folk artist Howard Fenster, who is really remarkable. So let me just set this timer real quick. Okay. The first time it happened, I must have been 5 years old, leaning over a ditch that cut through a neighbor's vegetable garden. And there, where I'd seen nothing, I now saw a flash of gold. The wet soil caught the sunlight at an angle where bits of mica shone like luminous stars. For several minutes, I stood transfixed. Then, in a daze, I plunged my hand into the mud. When it emerged, I saw a sparkle on the tip of my finger. I don't remember telling anyone about my find. I wanted it to belong only to me. It didn't matter if it turned out this wasn't gold. The flash was proof that the soil was full of wonder. By that age, I could already guess the general shape of my father's response. Why, this is just fool's gold. Haven't you seen that before? Growing up, I knew my father to be a man who spoke plainly about the world, someone whose primary goal for his son was for me to be a practical man. From the end, I began working hard for him every summer, mowing lawns, working on cars, outworking the men, employees at whatever needed to be hauled, often in the oppressively humid Arkansas heat. I was never prouder than in the moments when he bragged about my endurance, my manliness. Another side of him would come out at night, often after a mandatory session of wrestling, after he had held me in a headlock until I stopped whining, the term he used for my crying, and worked my way out of it. I became claustrophobic during these early years and still am to a certain degree, but these sessions taught me to slow my breathing and focus on an element of the room to calm my spiraling fear. Once I was able to work way out of his hold, he would relax. I imagine these lessons were no more fun for him than they were for me. They were his way of protecting me from what was to come. As he saw it, a life of violence and struggle as the owner of a cottage inn in a dying farming community of 100 people. For reasons I didn't understand, he was always getting into fights. And the stories of his childhood and adolescence were stories of extreme near-death experiences. Lying on our living room carpet, exhausted from wrestling, he would wrap one arm around me and pull me up to his chest, where I would lay my head and listen to his breathing. Then, often for hours at a time, my real father would emerge, telling me stories of his inventions, his Lovecraftian creations, the automatic toilet paper dispenser he developed blueprints 4 years before anyone else was talking about it, the wolf orang, a wolf orangutan chimera, waiting in our tree and pressing its furry face to the windows at night, searching for entry. My father told me he would protect me from the monsters, and I believed him. The world is familiar to most people, even if they've not seen most of it, especially if they have not seen most of it. In very short order, the concerns of life lessen our capacity for wonder. The Cowles Encyclopedia of Arkansas provides one of the few surviving records of my hometown of 100 people. Quote, in 2001, the only remaining store and the cotton gin ceased operations, leaving the Baptist Church as the only entity left in the community. Milligan Ridge, like many small Arkansas farming communities, could not compete with the forces of change. The lesson was clear. No matter how hard we tried, no matter how tough we became, we could not compete. Even so, in the mid-90s, when a corporate competitor wooed away most of his customers, my father did not give up. He was still the practical man who would find another job, another life for it. The one thing that did change, however, was my father's nightly storytelling, which disappeared from our lives. I was 13. The part of me that was most like him, the one who dreamed wonders, was hidden away in an effort to become the man he would be, at least for a while, and a tougher exterior emerged. My father moved us to another Arkansas town farther west, a larger town with a 2-screen theater that played mostly G-rated movies and a Walmart supercenter with a McDonald's inside. That was a big deal, by the way. My father, former cotton gin owner, became a Ford dealer over, and my mother, whose family had owned the cotton gin before my dad, wrote thank you notes at a small desk in the dealer. Summers I washed cars in the service department, befriending workers whose lives were full of violence, bar fights, jail, drug addiction. A man everyone called Wild Thing told me a story about his wife who had been critically injured when a train collided with her car as she was driving back from an affair, photographs in the passenger seat. God punishes those who err from the righteous path, he told me. After it was obvious to me that I might soon be tempted to err from the righteous path with another boy, I found a girlfriend. We dated for a few years, hopping between movie theater and Walmart McDonald's enough times to grow sick of them until I broke up with her without explanation. When I left for college in 2003, my father had already surrendered to the Lord, suddenly becoming a Baptist preacher, while the Ford dealership floundered and eventually shuttered like everything else in our lives. A year later, my parents forced me to attend a conversion therapy facility in Memphis, threatening to cut me off from my family if I didn't go. It would make me stronger, my father told me. It would protect me from the monsters out there who would want to hurt a faggot like me. I remember feeling as though the ground beneath my feet could no longer be trusted. I could no longer recognize myself in the mirror, dead eyes warning me that soon the rest of my body would be dead as well if I continued with my father's lessons. I had seen enough of the world to know it had nothing more to show me. Even so, from time to time, I would still spot those flashes of wonder. After I returned from Memphis with my queerness intact, I read Thoreau and felt compelled to study the ants beside my college's campus lake, watching the order they make if only you stare long enough. Once, after a dorm mate and I made each other come several times in his room, I awoke to see those ants descending from the windowsill onto the soiled t-shirt with ferocious industry. Sex brought me back to my sense of awe, if only for a moment. After a while, though, even sex became familiar. For most of us, the world shrinks and we try to do something about it. We planned for vacations, go to Honolulu, like Joan Didion might have it, find religion as my father did. Speaking to me just last month on the phone, he sounded like a changed man, the one who once whispered in my ear about the wolf orang. Gone is the man of headlocks and ultimatums. In his place is someone who regularly weeps at the sight of trees, who asked my forgiveness if he was ever wrong. I fell asleep and witnessed a new invention, he says, his voice more expressive than I've ever heard it. He tells me the sensation is of digging something whole out of the ground. He doesn't want me to mention it here for fear of prying eyes, so I will only say that it involves dogs and walking canes, and that like most as seen on TV long shots, it could make millions. I've never known him to lie, so when next he tells me that Jesus bleeds onto his bed sheets at night, I consider this to be a real vision. What some of us wouldn't give to be spiritually bled upon, if only we knew that the blood came to us whole, unmediated by the usual human bullshit. Sometimes be ungenerous in the face of his conversion. I want to ask him where this person was when I needed him most. How is it that he can access this creative self so late in life, while I, the man he created in his image, cannot? I want to tell him that I wasn't the one who needed converting, that I already was where he is now, but that he spoiled it with his lessons. He has made my reversion to a pure creative state nearly impossible. Because of him, sometimes it feels like I've already seen too much. I'm too world-weary at the age of 35. I'm like the unflattering protagonist of O'Connor's Good Country People, overeducated in certain specialized ways that make me narrow and ripe for plunder. I'm one of those people who see through to nothing, Joy Holga says, those moments before she's duped into loving a man who only wants to steal her artificial leg. The problem of growing old at a young age is that just when you think you've seen it all, you can be blind to the things you really need to see. Which leads me to Howard Fenster, a self-proclaimed prophet, former Baptist preacher, artist from Pennville, Georgia, who at the 1976 Missing Pieces Atlanta Historical Society Folk Art Exhibition spoke of inventions like refrigerators, washing machines, and automobiles as all in the earth, hidden. In that same speech recorded by Tom Patterson and Howard Fenster, Stranger from Another World, Fenster, age 60, stood before Governor Busby and Ms. Busby and declared that every human discovery was first hid in the earth, and that every artist must bring out the, quote, hidden man of the heart. Less than a year before his speech, at roughly the same age my father was when he received a calling to the ministry, Fenster claimed to have witnessed a vision while repairing one of his bicycles. The way he told it over the years in hundreds of interviews that shifted with the improvisations of a naturally gifted storyteller, Fenster dipped his finger in the white tractor enamel to patch something when he saw a face smiling back at him on the pad of his index finger. Paint sacred art, the face said. In dozens of recorded interviews, many of which can be found in David Fetcho's documentary, I Can Feel Another Planet in My Soul, the divine command never changes. Paint sacred art. Neither does the response. Incredulous, Fenster tells the face he cannot paint. How do you know, the face says. How do you know? How do you know? Well, how do I know? Fenster finally replies. Like my father, Fenster held dozens of jobs before he found his calling. Now he had only one job, to make art. In the decade to follow, Fenster became one of the most widely known artists in America, a regular staple at Phyllis Kyne's trend-setting New York Gallery, with bands like REM and Talking Heads commissioning his art for album covers, and Johnny Carson's Tonight Show inviting him to sing and pick at his banjo. His ubiquity seemed to mirror his art. Nearly every surface he painted was filled with minutiae. Where another artist might allow for the open sky of landscape painting, Fenster often crowded his skies with impossibly tall towers, angels, scrolls, sermons which stretched across the horizon, a grand display that some critics associate with horror vacui, or however you pronounce that, the fear of empty spaces, though I've come to see Fenster's excess as a fear of waste. According to the Paradise Garden Foundation, whose goal it is to preserve and maintain Fenster's vision, Fenster created 46,991 sacred objects by the time of his death in October 2001. He kept a running log at all times, often fashioning stray bits of wood to suit the purpose. The one I saw, mounted to a wall in the Paradise Garden gift shop and gallery annex, resembled the markings a loving family might keep of a growing child as he aged out of the home. I first discovered Fenster's work as part of the Stranger Paradise exhibition at Jewel Collins Smith Museum of Fine Arts at Auburn University. I was working as a TA for a poetry professor, and much like his students who had been tasked with creating ekphrastic poetry out of Fenster's visions, I found the unevenly painted angels and devils, along with the depiction of a cavernous hell filled with Fenster's Baptist sermons, both incredibly familiar and strangely foreign. My father's drawings, which he sometimes used to illustrate the points of his sermons, were not so different from these. The evangelical tracts of Chick publications, once so ubiquitous in Arkansas rest stops and gas station bathrooms, with gruesome depictions of death and hell awaiting every unbeliever, were only a few degrees hotter than Fenster. What was different, however, was the sense that all of these paintings were part of a larger sensibility, something just beyond the frame, which I had never seen before. So I'm going to stop there and just tell you in the last minute that I have a little bit about what I discovered, because it was so fun to do all this research. It was in the middle of the virus, so I went to Paradise Garden and stayed in a bed and breakfast that they had set up there, and they let me just walk the grounds without anyone there. And so I would just go out at night and sort of look at all these strange inventions that this man had created. And one of them, which the piece takes its name from, is called a mirror house. And it's just this really strange, tree shack with mirrors all over every surface. And one of the things that was really surprising was I discovered all these queer connections to Howard Fenster. There were so many queer artists who really learned from him. And he was surprisingly open-minded about it. And I'd come in expecting, to find someone who was very similar to my father in childhood. So it ended up being a very regenerative, kind of, I don't know, it made me hopeful about people and hopeful that they could change and that art could change. So that's my reading. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Garrett. That was marvelous. We're going to do a little tech swap over here, so we'll take just a second until we get to hear from artist Paul Stopforth. He's teaching a workshop this week called Discovering Drawing. Early in his career, Paul created work that reflected the repressive society in which he lived. Invited to be artist in residence at Tufts University, Stopforth left South Africa for the United States in the late 1980s. He taught drawing at both Harvard University and the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. He has exhibited in galleries and museums in South Africa, the United States, and Europe. In 2004, he discovered the Ruth First Memorial Lecture at Brandeis University. The Harvard Crimson praised the intricacy of his work, specifically the way he draws together the colors of light, the sounds of protest, of nations. Furthermore, his work has been described as a testimony to the violence perpetrated against those affected by apartheid. He is represented by the Schoolhouse Gallery in Provincetown. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Paul Stopforth.
Good evening. Thank you all for being here. Oh, the mask. It's like almost becomes part of you, you just forget to take it off. I'd like to thank Sarah, Rennie, and David for dealing with the setup here. I'm not well versed in contemporary technology, and I need the assistance of people like them, so thank you. I too am very grateful to be here. It's been 3 years since I taught a course here. It's somewhat nerve-wracking, but it's great to be back, and I'm delighted with the people I'm working with in the studio. Delighted to see a number of people who've been here before, particularly Kelly Groom, the great poet. It's a pleasure to see her. And if any of you know her on Facebook, she takes these great pics of Provincetown water that she swims in constantly. In fact, it's seldom that one sees her outside of the water. It's kind of a surprise. Okay, I don't have a timer, so Sarah, maybe, yeah, shout, wave, whatever, okay. This work goes back, and I don't think oh, it is working. I'm going back right to the beginning of my career as an artist, and it's a form of memoir, I realized while listening to Garrard. Of course, what art does, what poetry does, what literature does, is it reflects the life that produces it. So this is a form of memoir as well, and is not working. Okay, Bill of White Rights, 1971. And the frightening thing about these early images, of course, is that here we are again in a country where the lives of black people in particular are seen as disposable. And the people doing the disposing are exactly the same kind of people with the same kind of mind as those that existed in South Africa and, in fact, directed, controlled, and governed the country with appalling cruelty for not just for 50 years. I think one of the problems with history is that it tends to see, in the South African context, when the Afrikaans community became, in 1948, after the end of the Second World War, took over the government, they laid the grounds for the crimes that were committed under apartheid. The first time the Dutchman Jan van Riebeeck set foot in the Cape, which was 300 years before that, it began. The oppression and the destruction of the black people living in southern Africa began with the intrusion of the Europeans. Of course, the British, being the British, they codified it. One of the interesting things for me about this particular head is that the frame I painted, as you can see, white and black, which are the colors of the banners that were used in Nazi rallies. Here's another guy who we all know from January the 6th. He's the lead, okay? And these are the three men who were responsible for the death of a man I knew quite well, a friend of mine, a man called Stephen Bantu Biko, who was a young black activist arrested by the police for his establishment of what was called the Black Consciousness Movement, which echoed elements of Malcolm X's manifesto and philosophy. And these are fragments from, I was given access through one of the lawyers working for Steve's family to the autopsy photographs and did a series of drawings called the Biko series, which are recognized as icons of the art done during that period in opposition to the government. And this large drawing, 8 by 5 feet of Steve's body, as you all know from seeing the CSI type movies that when a body is autopsied, it is cut from the sternum to the pubic bone and then sewn up very roughly afterwards. And this photograph of Steve's body, the same damage had been done to his body during the autopsy. And what I did was a form of healing to remove the evidence of that mutilation through the drawing that I did. Okay, you saw the lead, and here is the leader. So all these echoes, what one thinks by leaving a certain country and escaping to another for various reasons, that you do so to find a form of safety, security, and of course that's really naive. We had the opportunity, my wife Carol and I, to go to England. Well, the last place one wants to be at the moment is England under Boris. Well, thank God Boris is no longer Boris, but nonetheless, these conditions that are created, as is obviously the case here, what's happening at present isn't as of, you all know the beast, right? 666. Isn't the result of what happened in 2016. It goes back to Reagan. Carol and I were very fortunate soon after arriving here to meet Howard Zinn. And there was certainly, Howard's view of America was, as those of you who've read him probably know, was complex. These people, the colonial couple, are exactly the kind of people who one would find at present in England, having voted for Boris, having voted for Brexit, and are now pretty miserable as a result, but of course they won't admit to having participated in that farce. On arriving in America, one of the first paintings that I did was this, which I called, I can't remember what I called it. Anyway, I'd never seen horseshoe crabs before until I came to Provincetown. And the blue outlines are a reference to horseshoe crabs. The lizard is a reference to a lizard who has survived thousands of years in the Namib Desert. So in a sense, it's a painting about immigration. It's two continents and my becoming an immigrant. I was influenced, although a lot of people see the influence of pointillism, and the influence really was Aboriginal Dreamtime paintings, these very beautiful beaded dots of color that create extraordinary patterns that relate directly to the landscape of Australia. So flowers behind are a reference to lotus blossoms in Buddhism, symbolic of transformation. And the skull is the skull of a baboon. And in Egyptian mythology, the baboon is the guardian of the air. And then the hand, the shape of the hands, is movement. So it's connected to air and the nature of breath and survival, I guess. These are two large paintings. The one on the right is in the collection of Bridgewater State College. And the one on the left, he's called Diviner. And the one on the left is called Freedom Dancer. And it's in the Constitutional Court in South Africa. It's approximately 8 feet across. It's made out of cut plywood. fair piece, but what I see now in retrospect, that Freedom Dancer is Steve's body released in a way. It has a symbolic, I think, link between happened in '94 when the apartheid regime was finally toppled and Nelson Mandela became the first black president of South Africa.
Anyway, So yes, I was totally involved in every aspect of it. David Drake, who is the artistic director of the Provincetown Theater, is someone that I know from ACT UP, actually. We were not friends, but we knew each other. When he took over the theater, I think it's 4 or 5 years ago, for the first few years he did revivals, but he was open to expanding into world premieres. And so we had a reading a few years ago, then there was COVID, then I was here for the full rehearsal period, and now I'm here, and I'm at the theater at the end of each performance every night. It's only on weeknights until the 21st.
Any questions or comments? Anything? Sarah?
Can I ask you to expand more on what you learned from Fenster? You kind of had to go go quickly at the end.
Sure. So I ended up talking with an artist who works at Kennesaw State University, where I'm an assistant professor, named Robert Scherer, and he actually has done some exhibitions here in P-Town, and he does these beautiful sort of wood cutting pieces, and he had lived with Howard for about a month, or maybe go on and off. He would live on the compound where Howard was art, and he was this punk, queer kid in the 80s who was just, really heavily into like certain really interesting scenes that Howard Fenster knew nothing about. And one of the really interesting stories that I got from this was he sort of became an apprentice to Howard Fenster, and Howard became a kind of father to him. And I have two stories with this. One is that he overheard, Howard just had this like telephone that was a dedicated line to anyone who wanted to call him when he got famous, and he would just like answer the phone and be like, "Hey, I'm Howard Fenster." It was really interesting. And Robert overheard Howard Fenster talking to Andy Warhol, and Andy Warhol had just like phoned him and said, I saw your stuff, it looks really interesting. And Howard was just like, yeah, just come down here and hang out. We'll just, do all kinds of fun stuff together, which I don't know what that would be, but, so there's that story. And then Robert had a boyfriend who would come and visit at Paradise Garden. And one day, this is a really steamy story, one day there was like an outdoor shower, and they were having a little bit of fun outside, making out, in a state of excitement, as he said. And Howard showed up. He was supposed to be gone, I think, at church or something, and he came back early. You're expecting a certain kind of story from this, right? Like the setup is like, how is Howard going to react? Is it going to be terrible? Is he going to be a bigot? And he just said, hey, when y'all boys are done, let's go have lunch. And then whenever they went over there and had lunch, he was like, I really don't mind it at all. Maybe just not outside, which I just thought was a really funny story. And yeah, I found all of these sort of local art connections to Howard that were really interesting in terms of, how many queer artists really looked up to him. And that was surprising to me. And, one of the things I was trying to not do in the piece, which, I only read a small part of, is I didn't want to create a false narrative where, this man wasn't uncomplicated. He didn't have, certain beliefs that could be, fairly challenging to anyone very open-minded. But he was, I think, just really interested in people. And that made it so that, some of his earlier odious ideas were kind of dissipated by the end of his career. He just wanted everyone to love, which was nice.
I haven't read your memoir yet. I just purchased it, and I was going to start tonight, but you assigned us an incredibly difficult homework project, so it's going to have to wait until tomorrow. But the little I've gleaned from our discussion today in class and your talk tonight, it's sort of stunning and humbling in some way to see you have some kind of reconciliation. I don't know if that's the right word necessarily with your father. And again, I don't know your whole story yet, but I'm wondering, what role you played in his changes, if any, and how that's impacted your work, I guess, more so than asking a personal question.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's impacted all of my work. The fact that the incredible luck in many ways to have parents who made a terrible mistake and then they admitted it, and they opened up a possibility for dialogue and reconciliation, which is a good word. When I was describing my father, I knew I couldn't write the book Erased if I couldn't get a complex portrait of my father, because I knew, he confounded me. He was a very interesting man, just like Howard Fenster in many ways. And so I wrote this chapter which showed, a lot of his complexity. And one of the things I said is he's not Jim Baker. He's not this huckster that's still selling, apocalyptic barrels in Branson, Missouri, which is what Jim Baker is doing. But he really wasn't, and he really believes deeply what he believes. I don't agree with it, and I don't, follow that kind of fundamentalist worldview, but he really does believe it. And unlike a lot of people who are hypocrites, he doesn't seem to be one. I mean, everyone hypocrite to a certain degree, but for the most part he's not. And that when I was talking earlier about Sarah's insights about the ACT UP movement and how we can learn from that, one of the things that was really interesting was when I was doing a lot of activism in conversion therapy, I kept hearing from my own community, stop paying so much attention to the parents, because it's triggering for people to talk about their parents, and not everyone has a great happy ending like you do. And I'm like, yeah, I know that. It's my own personal experience. I'm telling a truth, right? And I would hear one thing from really radically, queer activists who, were well-meaning, and they were telling me stop doing this type of activism. And then I would go to like Utah, where we were trying to end conversion therapy, and there was a real intense Mormon presence with conversion therapy, and people would say, thank you. Activists would say, thank you so much for not demonizing religion and for not demonizing these parents, because we can actually use this, and we can actually use our legislation. And when, believe it or not, a Republican Kentucky senator, actually, she proposed to end conversion therapy there. I mean, it's failing, of course, but she was using Erased as a model, and that was really why I did that. And there's a cost to that sort of stuff, but I think it's incredibly important. Anyway.
So, Paul, what advice do you have for us as we're sitting in this proto-fascist moment, waiting for it all to unveil?
Well, I guess in South Africa it appeared to be impossible that it would ever change, other than through violence. And not that there weren't certain levels of violence, there obviously were, but the war that was predicted by so many experts didn't take place, that a solution was found which continues to create problems, but there is an African National Congress, there is a black government. And I guess this is America, this can't go on. I mean, it's a shock that it has, what has arisen, obviously, we're all shocked. It is shocking, but it's going to change. I think whether I'll be alive is another question, but I do think that the January 6th inquiry is huge. I think as a historical document that's taking place in real time and will be recognized as an important document forever. It's happening right now. And that in itself, I think, is a reason to believe that there is something of value to be found in all of this. But the struggle, I mean, the word that was used constantly, first of all in Mozambique, and then, of course, it became a rallying cry in South Africa, a luta continua, the struggle continues. And I think we have the sense here of, the sense of safety, which is naive, a kind of innocence that is finally being drained from a more liberal perspective of America, and that's also good. But I think, it's obvious that the struggle is never over. I think thinking of, and I have a brother who lives in England and close friends there, that Brexit was a shock. How could, this great democracy, Churchill and God knows who else, Shakespeare, Francis Bacon, come on, guys. I mean, Johnson to England, he and his cronies, I mean, obviously it's not just him, as it's not just you-know-who. The damage that's been done to England is going to take generations to recover from. So, here we are.
Paul, I have a follow-up question. And
Sure.
Like Sarah, I was so moved by all three of you bearing witness to and documenting such extraordinary history, but Paul in particular was so profoundly moving tonight. I'm curious as well, I was so moved by the breadth of forms that you've used in your work and the kind of expertise and facility with different forms, and I was curious how content drove decisions around how you were creating your work, or how you kind of over the course of your career kind of explored those different materials and ideas, and how it was connected to the subject matter as well.
Well, I think one of the issues that I guess I have to accept is that my art isn't about art. I don't know if many of you know or have seen the work of Joel Janowitz. He had a show recently at Schoolhouse. At the Vors House, there were some very beautiful paintings of beach scenes, Provincetown, tidal pools, Australia. That's art. And those images could have been painted in Provincetown 50 or 60 years ago. I'm connected somehow, for some reason, to stories. What is happening to people's lives is much more interesting to me than what's happening in the art world. And at the Biko series, for example, I actually discovered and created a method, an incredibly labor-intensive, time-consuming method to make those drawings of Steve and the fragments of Steve's body from the autopsy photographs. But I ran out of, I lost, at a certain point you lose the connection. I can't tell the same story over and over again. My mind isn't sufficiently complex to do that. I am not Cézanne, I'm Paul, And as a result, so the angel Gabriel, the tension, there's a fabulous thing that I think you'll all like. The Afrikaners used to call me, as an English-speaking South African, a sout pil. Sout is salt, and pil is penis. Because what English people did, even if you were born in South Africa, as obviously I was and my parents and grandparents, was you had one foot in South Africa, the other foot in England, and your dangly part rested in the ocean, so you had a salt penis. but that tension, I mean, I think all immigrants have that tension. You're looking both ways all the time. And again, one of the things, to continue with answering your question, the generosity of Americans. If I had, as we were considering doing, going to England, I would never have found I don't think I would even been allowed to set foot in the hallowed halls of Oxford or Cambridge. Here I was teaching at Harvard. This is ridiculous. But this particular place, this particular space, this particular town, Carol and I were introduced to it many, many years ago when we first came here, 32 years ago, by close friends who are also from South Africa. And I mean, the generosity of folk that I'm aware of, not only in terms of my own experience, but the experience of people who I've, become friends with, who I've shared information with. So, and this goes beyond this particular place. It might be threatened, but it's, you're going to win, man. You just are. Come on.
This question is for all three of you, but all of you really highlighted art as part of social change, as part of activism. And to your point of this kind of proto-fascist moment, this inflection point in history, what art are you all finding particularly vital? What art makes you particularly excited that we should all be paying attention to?
I don't have any answer for that. I think the days of the work of art that change the world are over. It's a increasingly privatized and rarefied world that's separate from what's going on in the country. And most people are exposed to entertainment. And entertainment tells us what we already know. So I don't have an answer.
I tend to agree with the trend that's happening. And we talked in our class today about the unexpected and reaching a kind of deeper truth in our own stories. And I think that's rarer every day. The received truth is what we have. But that being said, I was a very cynical person before I wrote my book. And I think it did change legislation. And, with the help of a film, which I'm still bitter about. But I think that I think stories themselves maybe still have the potential, like personal stories may still have a certain potential to change people's minds. But yeah, I think we're at a tipping point in terms of art. I just returned to the Scarlet Letter recently. I read it every year, and I just love that book for its generosity, its depth of understanding of social relationships, and its ability to be, to take something that would otherwise be seen as, a person to be judged, and to really take that energy and make her, Esther Prynne, a full character. It's just really beautiful to me.
One of my favorite painters is this woman named Rochelle Fiennes. She recently had a big retrospective. She's like 75. She says artists work to their capacity. I think that's true, and it's a really hard pill to swallow. Like, people really make the best work that they're capable of making. So when you see people making work that's pandering or selling out or that's palatable, that's the best they can do. And people who can make work that transcends that do that. And we're in a situation where there's a lot of reward for the people who can make those work that reinforces the system. I know, because, I've been around a long time, and one thing I learned, like as a novelist, about bestsellers, you have to be that kind of person. You can't fake it. It's only those kind of people that can really do that, make a work that doesn't actually threaten anything. You have to be that way. So.
We're not done.
I recently bought, and have only read part of it, Caroline Forcher's the angel of history. You know, we're part of history. We're not separate from it. If we think we are, we're fooling ourselves. And I think that recognizing that we are part of it, recognizing that suffering is integral to all histories, and that I find that poetry is a resource just because it helps me accept where I am rather than wish I was somewhere else. So I think that's the main thing, to, is it a Zen thing? Be where you are. Mm-hmm. And that's a tough thing to do, but I think it's the only thing to do. Yeah.
I want to add to that's really beautiful. When you mentioned poetry, that got me thinking a lot about, you know, I try to read poetry before I write, because regardless of, like, you know, how popular it is or whether or not people read poetry anymore, I think that being able to shift the way that you see the world is incredibly important, and it's a magic trick, and it's always amazing to me that we have, you know, any art that does that. And so to me, like, I care deeply whether or not it gets popular, but I'm also just like, well, can you believe we ever made this? Mm-hmm. It's just so beautiful. And that keeps me happy.
Okay. Hi, this is a question for Sarah. It's more practical than anything else, but I don't know if you can divulge. But I'm interested, you're so incredibly prolific and in different genres, what your process is.
I really don't have one. I honestly think it's neurological. You know, writing is very easy for me. I can't tell you why something is a play and something is a book, and I don't know the difference, and it just comes out a certain way. And it's always been that way since I was like 6 or whatever. So there's no magic.
And you can work on multiple things at the same time.
Work on multiple things, and it doesn't need to be like from 9 to 10:30 every morning or anything like that.
Wow, that's amazing.
Thank you all for your work. I'm so sorry I got here. I thought it started at 7, so I humbly apologize. I just actually wanted to respond to this gentleman to just say that I think it's important to remember that this is Provincetown, and I haven't read that new book called The Shores of Bohemia, but this is where Frankenthaler did, and, you know, Stanley Kunitz wrote poems, and Mary Oliver wrote poems and got up at 5:30 every morning, or 4, whatever the hell she did. I mean, that we all come here partly because it is such an inspiring place, and the light and the people who come and study here and teach here. And so of course, I totally respect the fact that this is such a dark time, and there's not maybe one person to point to say, you know, this is who you should read right now so you don't kill yourself in despair. But I come here for that reason, so I hope that we can all be inspired by the history of this place, which, you know, abstract expressionism partly came from here, and, you know, just even the idea of being an art colony and queer theater and the Provincetown Players. I'll stop, but yeah, because I'm a little bit obsessed with the history of Provincetown, but just had to say this, so thank you.
Can we have one more round of applause, please, for our outstanding faculty? Thank you all. And don't forget to join us tomorrow. Romolo Del Dio will be talking about his work that is currently in the Venice Biennale. And Wednesday, we have another faculty talk at 6 o'clock. The event tomorrow is at 6:30. They're both open to the public, and we hope you will all come. Thank you, and have a great night. Yes, and we're going to sign books over here, and the books are for sale back here. We have great merchandise that's wonderful for purchase, so get out your wallets.